Victorian England liked to imagine itself as the most orderly place on earth. A land where everyone knew their place, their posture, and the exact angle at which a respectable person should hold a teacup. But beneath the polite smiles and polished boots, the era was a maze of unwritten rules, strange rules, rules so specific, so theatrically fussy, that breaking one could cause more scandal than accidentally burning down a textile mill. Which, by the way, happened quite a lot. Imagine walking through a fog-soaked London street, gas lamps flickering, carriages clattering over cobblestone, and every passerby silently ranking you based on your outfit, your hairstyle, and whether your gloves look slightly too Tuesday morning for a Wednesday afternoon. Victorians didn't just live life, they curated it. They wove in their days around rituals and expectations, rehearsing every gesture like actors in an endless social performance. And if you dared improvise, oh, society would notice. Society always noticed. This was an era where appearances weren't just important, they were gospel. You were judged before you spoke, and often before you even breathed properly. But appearance was only the first rule in a very long rule book. A rule book no one ever wrote down, yet everyone was expected to memorize. Break a rule, and you invited whispers. Bend a rule, and you invited trouble. Ignore a rule entirely? Well, you could forget about receiving dinner invitations for the next decade. But this is exactly what makes the Victorians so fascinating. Beneath all their seriousness and moral posturing lay a world built on contradictions. They preached modesty, yet adored extravagant fashion. They demanded restraint, yet filled parlors with dramatic fainting couches. They claimed to value privacy, yet monitored each other with the intensity of neighborhood cats watching a new bird feeder. Their rules were everywhere, at the dinner table, in the parlor, in the street, at funerals, during courtship, in the workplace, even in mourning, especially in mourning. And today, we're stepping straight into that maze. We'll wander from drawing rooms to dance halls, from stiff-collared etiquette manuals to the silent politics of glove selection. We'll explore the 14 strangest rules that shaped Victorian life and shaped the people who had to survive it. Every rule connects to the next, forming a long, dizzying chain of expectations that kept society standing upright, even when its foundation was wobbling like an undercooked pudding. Before we descend into this world of lace, lanterns, and lingering judgment, take a moment to steady yourself, because if the Victorians were watching, they'd already have notes about your posture. And if you enjoy history served with a bit of atmosphere, a touch of humor, and a generous spoonful of, wait, they really did that? Make sure you're subscribed to Boring Owl. Around here, we explore the past the way Victorians explored etiquette, obsessively, curiously, and with the occasional raised eyebrow. Now, let's turn the page of the Victorian rulebook, and let's begin with the first rule, the one that governed everything else. The rule of appearances. The Victorians believed the world ran on rules, but none were taken as seriously as the rules of appearance. To them, appearance wasn't simply how you looked. It was the first sentence in a story you were telling every person you passed, and heaven forbid that story suggested anything less than respectable. A rumpled collar or mismatched glove could destroy your reputation faster than a runaway horse in a crowded marketplace. This wasn't vanity. This was survival. Victorian society was built on layers of silent judgment, stacked higher than their top hats, and appearances were the only shield most people had. Imagine stepping out your front door in 1865. You haven't even locked the latch yet, and already, Mrs. Cartwright from across the street is pretending to rearrange her curtains so she can assess your outfit. She notes whether your hem is a fraction too short, whether your boots are duller than they ought to be, and whether your bonnet ribbon looks suspiciously frayed. She will report her observations to at least 3 people by sundown. This was Victorian surveillance, less official, far more personal, and infinitely more relentless. It started with clothes. Clothing acted as a coded map of who you were, what you earned, what you believed, and whether you'd been raised properly, or tragically, shamefully, without guidance. Every stitch, every button, every fabric choice came loaded with meaning. Wool marked practicality. Silk suggested refinement. Velvet hinted at luxury, or at least the desperate wish for it. Too much lace made you appear frivolous, while too little made you look painfully dull. The goal was refined, but not showy. Tasteful, but not flamboyant. Modest, but not miserable. In other words, good luck. Victorian women in particular woke each morning to a silent test, not of intelligence or kindness or capability, but of their ability to lace themselves into respectability. Corsets, those iron-willed undergarments, were not optional. A woman who didn't wear one was considered practically ungoverned, as though the lack of boning in her bodice indicated a lack of discipline in her soul. The corset didn't just shape the body, it shaped public opinion. A proper silhouette communicated order, restraint, and moral fortitude, even if the wearer felt like collapsing by noon. And if she actually did collapse, well, fainting in public was considered far more respectable than going about uncorseted. Men didn't have it easier. Their appearance rules were simply different, equally strict, and arguably just as uncomfortable. The respectable Victorian man was expected to be a walking sculpture of self-control, dressed in dark, somber fabrics that signaled dignity and dependability. Bright colors? Too flamboyant. Loose tailoring? Too lazy. Facial hair? Acceptable, provided it was shaped like you'd measured each whisker with a pocket ruler. A drooping mustache implied carelessness. An uneven beard? Barbaric. A man's grooming routine could not falter. Even the shine of his boots mattered. You could tell how responsible he was by the reflection of a street lamp in his toe cap. And then there were the hats. Hats were everything. To wear the wrong hat for the wrong time of day was a social catastrophe worthy of Greek tragedy. Morning hats, afternoon hats, evening hats, wool for winter, straw for summer. A gentleman removing his hat indoors signaled respect. Failing to do so signaled that he'd been raised by wolves. Every hat movement had a proper protocol, and each small mistake chipped away at your perceived decency. There were posture rules, too. A person's stance acted as a visual resume. Stand ramrod straight, chin forward, shoulders back. This was the approved posture of someone with self-respect. Slouching was a crime of character. Leaning on a wall suggested moral instability. Standing with feet too far apart looked undignified. Standing with feet too close together looked nervous. And crossing your arms? Only acceptable if you were freezing, and even then, frowned upon. Walking came with rules as well. A respectable Victorian walk was deliberate, moderate, and controlled. You weren't to rush, because rushing implied desperation. Nor were you to stroll with too much leisure, because that suggested idleness, which suggested impropriety. Your stride should be smooth, your pace consistent, your steps neither too large nor too small. Women were to glide, men to stride. Anything outside this guideline risked attracting the wrong kind of attention, or worse, gossip. Even the act of sitting had its own choreography. A gentleman sat with precision, legs placed neatly, hands visible, back straight. A lady sat as though sculpted, crossing her ankles rather than her knees, ensuring her skirt draped in a visually pleasing way. Dropping into a seat or lounging casually was out of the question. Furniture wasn't to be used. It was to be respected. A sofa was not an invitation to relax. It was a test of your ability to maintain dignity while pretending to relax. The expectations extended to grooming. Cleanliness was not just about hygiene, it was about morality. A clean collar meant a clean conscience. Shining shoes signaled shining character. Hair had to be brushed, pinned, curled, or shaped according to one's status. A few stray hairs escaping a woman's bun could cause a minor social crisis. Men with untrimmed nails were considered practically lawless. The Victorians equated grooming with virtue, an entertaining concept considering many lived near coal-thick smog. People also judged your social class by what you carried. A woman's handbag wasn't merely decorative, it indicated refinement and self-control. Too large, and she looked indulgent. Too small, and she looked impractical. A man's walking stick wasn't for walking. It was a badge of sophistication. Even children had appearance rules, dressed like miniature adults to demonstrate that their parents were raising them properly. And this was only the beginning. Because once you passed the visual inspection, once society decided you looked reasonably respectable, you then faced the next layer of rules: how to behave. A person could be dressed perfectly and still fail miserably by speaking too loudly, laughing at the wrong moment, or daring to show emotion stronger than mild amusement. Appearances were the armor that allowed entry into the battlefield of Victorian manners. Without the armor, you were dismissed, ignored, sometimes pitied, occasionally judged with such intensity that it could follow your family for years. A single wardrobe misstep could sabotage a marriage prospect, derail a business deal, or invite the kind of whispers that made your name travel farther than your carriage ever could. But Victorians didn't see their appearance rules as oppressive. They saw them as necessary. Society was vast, bustling, and divided by class, wealth, and ambition. The rules helped people understand where they fit. Clothes and posture acted as silent signposts, telling others how to treat you, what to expect of you, and whether they should trust you. In a world filled with constant social climbing, maintaining the illusion of perfection mattered more than personal comfort. These rules also offered a sense of stability. In an era changing faster than most people could process, industrialization, new machines, scientific discoveries, shifting social structures, appearance remained something people could control. Holding on to rigid standards made the world feel orderly, predictable, safe, even if those standards occasionally required fainting couches, rib-crushing corsets, and shoes tight enough to make ankles weep. There was a darker side, too. Appearances became a cage. People hid behind their clothing and posture, afraid that any slip would reveal too much. Even the wealthy weren't immune. They spent fortunes maintaining the illusion of effortless elegance. They feared the slightest sign of wear, the smallest tear, the faintest discoloration that hinted at imperfection. Middle-class families bankrupted themselves trying to imitate upper-class fashion. Working-class people stretched their budgets on Sunday-best clothing they rarely wore, hoping to appear respectable, if only for a few hours each week. This obsession with appearance shaped every social interaction, creating a drama in which everyone played their part with exhausting dedication. A man tipping his hat to a stranger wasn't simply being polite, he was reinforcing a hierarchy. A woman adjusting her gloves was signaling control. A servant wearing a crisp uniform was performing respectability on behalf of someone else. And yet, for all their posturing, Victorians knew these rules were impossible to follow perfectly. They were too many, too detailed, too contradictory. But perfection wasn't the point. The point was the attempt. Trying to appear proper was what made you respectable, even if the effort nearly suffocated you. The ironies were endless. Victorians tried to present themselves as calm, moral, orderly human beings, while living under the constant pressure of inspection. Behind every elegant silhouette was a person sweating, straining, and worrying about whether they looked sufficiently dignified. Behind every correct bow or curtsy was a rehearsed performance, delivered with the terror of someone who knew how fragile their reputation really was. And of course, once you mastered appearance, or at least avoided disaster, you earned the privilege of tackling the next set of rules. Because appearing respectable was only half the challenge. Behaving respectably was an entirely different battlefield. And that is where the Victorian rulebook truly begins to sharpen its edges. If you're ready for that world of rigid manners, quiet performances, and conversational minefields, then step with me into the next chapter, where appearances give way to behaviors, and where a single misplaced gesture can cause more chaos than a toppled tea tray ever could. The rule of proper behavior. Victorian society liked to pretend that once a person looked respectable, the rest would fall neatly into place. It didn't. Appearance was merely the ticket in. Once you passed the visual inspection, once your boots shone, your corset behaved, and your hat sat at a mathematically approved angle, you were allowed to enter the second arena, behavior. Here, the rules grew sharper, quieter, more suffocating, and far more absurd. Looking proper was difficult. Behaving properly was a lifelong chore. Behavior regulated everything from how loudly one breathed to how far apart one's elbows should be while seated at a dinner table. A proper Victorian didn't simply exist, they existed politely. Every gesture had a purpose, every expression a meaning, and every word a weight. To live in Victorian society was to walk through a field of unmarked social landmines, hoping you wouldn't accidentally detonate scandal by laughing too freely at someone's joke. The first rule of behavior was knowing when to speak. Silence was often preferable, especially if you were a woman, a servant, a child, or simply someone without anything particularly uplifting to say. So, most people. Victorians adored conversation, but only the right kind. Light topics, delicate observations, gentle compliments. Heavy topics, money, politics, illness, bodily functions of any kind, were off limits. If a conversation wandered into anything resembling real life, the invisible etiquette referee blew a silent whistle, and everyone politely steered it back to safer waters, usually weather or wallpaper. This made social visits thrilling, in a slow, suffocating way. You had to be interesting without being too interesting, confident without being bold, humorous without being improper, witty enough to entertain, mild enough to avoid offense. Stray too far in any direction, and you risked raising eyebrows, something no Victorian wanted, unless discussing architecture. Even greetings came with regulations. A handshake between men had to be firm, but not forceful. Too weak, and you were timid. Too strong, and you were aggressive. Women rarely shook hands at all. Instead, they offered slight, graceful nods, as though acknowledging both your presence and the delicate fragility of the social fabric. Bowing and curtsying had their own detailed instructions. A bow too deep? Overly dramatic. Too shallow? Disrespectful. A curtsy held too long looked theatrical. Cut too short, and it looked lazy. Then came expressions. Victorians didn't smile without a reason. A polite smile was acceptable. A broad smile was suspicious. Excessive cheerfulness suggested either poor upbringing or possible madness. Emotional restraint was a virtue, one that required steady practice. Faces were to remain calm, composed, mildly pleasant, and very, very controlled. If you were delighted, you showed a glimmer. If you were enraged, you showed nothing at all. Victorians would endure a catastrophic house fire with the same expression they used when tasting slightly undersugared tea. And laughter. Laughter came with strict boundaries. Gentle, quiet, socially safe laughter was welcome. Anything more enthusiastic risked drawing attention, which risked drawing judgment, which risked invitations drying up faster than a fountain in a Victorian drought. Women were especially discouraged from laughing loudly. A woman who laughed openly was said to lack refinement, propriety, and possibly the mental constitution needed for polite society. Men, too, had to restrain themselves. A man who guffawed was considered as unruly as one who arrived at dinner with a crooked cravat. Dining was its own battlefield. Entire books were written about proper table behavior, though most Victorians pretended they knew the rules naturally. Fork in the left hand, knife in the right, but do not lift your elbows. Do not eat too quickly or too slowly. Do not cut bread with a knife. Tear it gently, as though bread itself had delicate feelings. Do not speak with your mouth full or even half full. Do not gesture with your utensils. Do not reach across the table. Do not lean too far forward or too far back. Essentially, do not behave like someone who actually needs to eat. Victorians believed manners revealed character. A person who slurped soup with enthusiasm was not merely rude. They were morally suspect. Soup, in fact, was the ultimate test of manners. You must sip it noiselessly, spooning the liquid away from yourself, as though fearful it might leap out of the bowl and embarrass you. Fail, and the entire table noticed. Succeed, and no one praised you, because behaving perfectly was simply expected. Visitors were judged on how they held teacups. 2 fingers only, no pinky raised. It was considered an embarrassing misconception often attributed to aristocrats who, in reality, would have rather perished than be caught doing it. Teacups were to be held delicately, sipped quietly, and placed back on the saucer without clinking. A single clink might pass. 2 clinks were a cry for help. 3 suggested you were unfit for civilization. The rules extended into movement. Victorian behavior demanded efficiency with elegance. No sudden gestures, no exaggerated motions, no dramatic arm waving. You never pointed, unless you wanted to look like a rude tourist in your own century. Instead, you indicated direction with a soft hand motion, vaguely in the general area. If someone didn't understand, well, that was their problem. And these rules applied everywhere. At church, during strolls in parks, while riding trains, even while shopping. Public behavior mattered most because public spaces were full of observers. Victorians didn't have reality television, but they had each other, and that was far worse. People judged your walking speed, your posture, your hand placement, even your cough. A proper cough was discreet. Anything louder suggested carelessness or poor breeding. Interactions between the sexes were controlled with even greater care. Unmarried men and women were to behave like two polite planets, orbiting each other without ever colliding. Speaking alone with a member of the opposite sex was risky. Standing too close was scandalous. A prolonged glance was practically a proposal. And if two people were caught laughing together, well, that was practically an engagement announcement. Behavior also extended to emotions. Victorians believed strong feelings were best expressed through tasteful understatement. Joy could be acknowledged with a small smile. Grief could be indicated with a quiet sigh. Rage could be hinted at through a very slight tightening of the jaw. Anything beyond that was unseemly. Even during funerals, wailing was considered inappropriate unless you were an infant or an opera singer, and even then frowned upon. These expectations weighed heavily on everyone, but were especially punishing for those with naturally expressive personalities. A lively woman had to dampen her brightness. A boisterous man had to shrink himself. Children were trained early to remain silent, still, and obedient. Servants learned to move like shadows. Emotional discipline was as vital as physical discipline. The ideal Victorian behaved like a calm, well-mannered ghost drifting politely through life. Yet beneath all this restraint brewed constant anxiety. If appearance was the armor, behavior was the battlefield strategy, and everyone knew one mistake could undo months of careful reputation building. A misplaced laugh, a poorly timed joke, an enthusiastic handshake, these could haunt a person for weeks. Worst of all was unintentional rudeness. If you failed to greet someone properly, or forgot a thank you note, or didn't return a call in the socially correct time frame, you might as well have insulted their entire lineage. But the strictness of behavior also offered a strange benefit. It created predictability, a framework, a map to follow. People knew how to behave because the rules told them how. They knew what to expect from others. There was safety in uniformity, order in restraint, comfort in knowing exactly how to fold your napkin before the soup arrived. And these behavior rules were not isolated. They blended directly into the next great set, the rules of courtship. Once you mastered appearing respectable and behaving correctly, you were finally ready, barely, to navigate one of the most tightly controlled social arenas of the Victorian world. Courtship was a balancing act of propriety, hope, coded gestures, and chaperones lurking like moral bodyguards. Which brings us, inevitably, to the next chapter, the quiet battlefield of romance, the delicate dance of chairs placed exactly 3 feet apart. The subtle flutter of a fan that could speak entire conversations. the elaborate rituals that determined who might marry whom, and under what painfully proper circumstances. If you thought behavior was strict, wait until you see what the Victorians did with love. The rule of courtship. Victorian courtship was not romance, it was not passion, it was not even particularly personal. It was, more than anything, a highly supervised sport, one where the spectators had whistles, scorecards, and opinions strong enough to knock the crown off Queen Victoria herself. If appearance was the armor and behavior the battlefield, then courtship was the chessboard. Every move mattered. Every glance carried meaning, and every wrong step risked ruining your future, your reputation, and your family's plan for your life. Love might have played a supporting role, but the real star was propriety, looming over everything like an overbearing chaperone. For young Victorians, especially those in the middle and upper classes, courtship rarely began with feelings. It began with being visible. Polite society was engineered to display eligible young people like well-behaved merchandise. Balls, garden parties, musicals, church gatherings, promenades in popular parks, these were the polite hunting grounds. But even in a casual social setting, nothing was casual. A glance was choreographed. A greeting was supervised. A dance request required permission, and even then, it had to be granted by someone whose approval weighed more than your own desires. Courtship began with introductions. One did not speak to a stranger, not even a charming one, without a formal introduction delivered by a mutually approved acquaintance. An introduction acted like an official stamp of human legitimacy. Without it, you were invisible. Worse, you were scandalous for being visible in the wrong way. Once introduced, a man could request the honor of a dance or a brief conversation, preferably about unthreatening topics like seasonal flowers, mild weather, or the opera performance everyone pretended to enjoy last week. Even conversation was regulated. Too much interest was improper. Too little interest was rude. A man was expected to speak with confidence, but not arrogance, wit, but not boldness, warmth, but not familiarity. A woman was expected to respond with grace, modesty, and just enough charm to signal she was receptive without giving any impression of eagerness. Eagerness was suspicious. Eagerness suggested a lack of restraint, and restraint was the foundation of Victorian romance. If the initial interaction met societal approval, the next phase involved the ritual of calling. Calling was a system so complex it could have been used to run a country. A man who wished to pursue a woman submitted his calling card to her household. The card would sit on a silver tray in the hall, waiting its turn for judgment. If the family approved, they permitted the man to visit, though not often and never without supervision. If they did not approve, the card was quietly ignored, placed at the bottom of the tray, or moved aside entirely, signaling rejection without the discomfort of saying anything directly. Calling visits were chaperoned. Always. A courting couple never met alone. Privacy was a dangerous luxury that might awaken feelings, encourage impulsive behavior, or even, heaven forbid, lead to an unsanctioned moment of closeness. Mothers, aunts, older sisters, and family friends served as chaperones, hovering like polite but unyielding guard dogs. Their presence implied trust, while their watchful eyes implied the complete opposite. During a calling visit, a couple might sit in a parlor, each perched uncomfortably on stiff furniture that looked far more decorative than functional. They could talk about art, literature, or the latest public scandal, the mild ones. They could comment on the wallpaper, admire the potted plants, or discuss the piano one of them was too nervous to play. But they were forbidden from anything personal. Questions about dreams, feelings, fears, ambitions, these were entirely too intimate. Courtship was expected to be conducted with the emotional distance of two diplomats exchanging pleasantries. The parlor itself was a stage. A chair placed too close suggested impropriety. A chair placed too far suggested disinterest. A window opened too widely allowed dangerous breezes, which could ruffle hair and cause unrestrained flirtation. Every detail mattered. Even the length of the visit was measured. Too long, and the couple risked suspicion. Too short, and the man seemed uncommitted. In this era of coded restrictions, fans and gloves became tools of subtlety. A woman's fan was practically another language. A slow wave meant boredom. A rapid wave meant anxiety. A fan held near the heart suggested interest. A closed fan meant, do not try anything. And dropping a fan, deliberately or accidentally, was an entire social event. A man who picked it up might be considered attentive. A man who hesitated might be considered indifferent. But a man who picked it up too quickly, overly eager, possibly dangerous, likely unsuitable. An exchange of gloves signaled a deeper stage of courtship. To gift or receive a glove was intimate in the Victorian sense, emotionally suggestive, but not improper. A glove held tenderly hinted at affection. A glove returned suggested declining interest. A glove kept without explanation was practically the Victorian equivalent of saving someone's number. If courtship progressed successfully, the couple might reach the point where walking together in public became permitted. This was a milestone, a sign of growing seriousness, and an opportunity for society to begin whispering in earnest. The walk had to be short, supervised, and conducted with a level of decorum that suggested the pair were studying scenery rather than each other. They walked at a modest pace, never hurrying, never dawdling, careful not to stand too close or make accidental contact. Even brushing fingers was a dramatic event, the kind that would keep a woman thinking for days and a chaperone watching more closely next time. Letters played a role too, but only after a certain level of approval. A man could send a letter, but only with parental permission. A woman could respond, but only under guidance. Letters were examined, not for forbidden content, but for tone, propriety, and handwriting quality. Sloppy handwriting suggested a sloppy character. Overly ornate handwriting suggested frivolity. Sentences too emotional invited alarm. A good courting letter was warm, yet distant, hopeful, yet restrained, personal, yet entirely impersonal. And then came the proposal, a ritual wrapped in rules so thick one could hardly find the actual moment beneath them. A man did not simply propose. He first sought permission from the woman's father, whose mood, opinions, and expectations could shape the outcome more firmly than the woman herself. If the father approved, the man planned a formal moment, often in the presence of the family or at least within earshot, ensuring proper decorum. A proposal was expected to be heartfelt but controlled. No dramatic gestures, no tears, no trembling speeches. Pure sentiment was considered improper. Romantic excess was unthinkable. A well-conducted proposal sounded less like a declaration of love and more like an application for a long-term moral partnership. Accepting too flatly looked ungrateful. Even the manner of saying yes was governed by nuance. The family usually celebrated with polite enthusiasm, though too much enthusiasm hinted at desperation and too little hinted at disapproval. But of course, not all courtships went as society wished. Some were rejected, carefully and quietly. A returned calling card or discontinued visit schedule usually signaled the end. Some were prolonged for years because the families disapproved, or the finances weren't secure, or the couple lacked sufficient social harmony, which is to say, they made too many chaperones uncomfortable. Occasionally, a scandal erupted. A too long walk, a letter too affectionate, a meeting unsupervised. These scandals created storms of gossip so thick one could practically see the words swirling above the rooftops. Yet, beneath the rules and rituals, beneath the parlor chairs and fan signals, something tender often bloomed. Despite the suffocating expectations, many Victorians genuinely found companionship within the confines of these regulations. Some even found love. Quiet, patient, carefully nurtured love. They learned to read meaning in a glance, depth in a subtle smile, affection in a respectful distance. Their emotions lived within the margins of propriety, but they lived nonetheless. Courtship was not merely about choosing a partner. It was about entering marriage with the understanding that the rules would only grow more complex, more binding, more politically charged. Marriage did not free a Victorian from expectations. Marriage was a contract layered with duties, roles, and performances that could make courtship look like carefree rebellion in comparison. For now, though, our couple stands on the threshold of this next phase. Two people bound by propriety, preparing to enter a world where their roles become fixed, their duties defined, and their performances expected to continue indefinitely. Victorian romance was merely the prelude. Victorian marriage was the full production. And so, with courtship complete and society satisfied, we head into the next chapter. The rules that governed marriage itself. An entire universe of expectations, where affection was allowed, partnership encouraged, but propriety remained the unwavering, ever-present director of the show. The rule of marriage. If Victorian life had a backbone, it wasn't industry or empire or that ever-expanding network of train tracks slicing across the countryside. No, what truly held the era together was the absolute, unshakable, almost theatrical obsession with respectable conversation. This was not mere talking. This was verbal etiquette performance art. Every syllable, every facial expression, every pause between "good evening" and "how delightful to see you" carried meaning. And if you strayed off script, well, prepare yourself. You'd be judged harder than a debutante whose dance card remained suspiciously blank. Victorians treated conversation like it was a fragile Victorian vase, beautiful, expensive, and capable of shattering into 1,000 sharp pieces at the slightest mishandling. Too bold? Scandalous. Too silent? Rude. Too cheerful? Suspicious. Too gloomy? Well, that was allowed, but only if you did it elegantly. Melancholy was practically a sport. Picture a drawing room filled with people sitting very straight, all waiting for the right moment to say something appropriate. The carpet muffles footsteps, a clock ticks loudly enough to count as a participant, and the air smells faintly of polished wood and whatever perfume was fashionable among the well-to-do that year. It was a place where conversation was expected to drift gently, like a polite boat ride across a still lake. No waves, no storms, and absolutely no splashing. Which brings us to the rule. You must never, under any circumstances, bring up anything too emotional, too personal, or too real. The Victorians had an entire mental blacklist of topics that were simply off the conversational table. Money? Forbidden. Politics? Dangerous. Illness? Only in euphemisms. Relationships? Only in coded phrases so subtle you'd miss them if you blinked. Your hopes and dreams? Absolutely not. Keep those locked in a drawer with your diary and your unexpressed feelings. This was an era where the weather wasn't just small talk, it was life-saving small talk, a reliable conversational parachute. If a silence stretched too long, someone would gracefully remark, "The air is rather sharp this evening," and everyone would inhale with relief. You've never seen gratitude until you've watched Victorians thank the sky itself for giving them something to say. But beneath the calm surface of these exchanges, danger lurked, social minefields, which brings us to the next layer of the rule. Everything you said, no matter how harmless, could be interpreted as a coded message. Compliment someone's outfit too enthusiastically, and they might think you're mocking it. Mention a recent visit to Brighton, and someone will wonder what you were really doing there. Offer an opinion, and suddenly half the room is trying to decipher whether you meant something deeper. And so Victorian conversation became a sort of linguistic dance, elegant, practiced, and performed under pressure. You were expected to keep up, to glide, to speak lightly enough to avoid offense, but confidently enough to seem interesting. And if you couldn't manage that delicate balance, well, that was what fainting couches were for. Not just for fainting, mind you. They were emotional escape pods. If someone made a conversational misstep, it was easier to swoon dramatically than admit the awkwardness. Yet, despite these pressures, Victorians adored gatherings. They loved calling on neighbors, hosting tea, organizing dinners, and attending soirees. Because beneath all the rules and expectations, conversation was one of the few social arenas where a person could gently, politely, and very respectfully show some personality, just not too much. Take, for example, the art of the well-timed anecdote. Telling a story was acceptable, but only if it met a strict checklist. Was it inoffensive? Did it involve no one who might be present? Did it contain no bodily functions, no politics, no conflict? Congratulations! You were allowed approximately 6 sentences. After that, it was best to steer back towards something safer, like the weather again. The Victorians probably gave the weather more attention than actual meteorologists. They also believed in the power of the graceful silence. In fact, silence was often viewed as more virtuous than speaking. A person who talked too much risked seeming vulgar or attention-seeking. But a person who sat quietly, nodding at appropriate intervals, that was a model citizen, a pillar of dignity, someone deeply respected, provided their quietness looked intentional, not socially terrified. But the rule didn't stop at what you said. It extended to how you said it. Tone mattered. Posture mattered. Even the placement of your hands mattered. Too animated, and you seemed theatrical. Too stiff, and you seemed unfriendly. Too relaxed, and you seemed improper. Victorians practically invented the concept of reading the room, and boy, did they take it seriously. And yet, despite all this complicated etiquette, drawing rooms were full every evening. People arrived in droves, removed their gloves with expert grace, and settled in for hours of carefully curated interaction. Why? Because conversation was social currency. It was how alliances formed, impressions were made, and reputations were maintained. A brilliant conversationalist, one who could keep things light, avoid faux pas, and never allow tension to gather, was valued more than someone with wealth or looks. Good talkers opened doors. Bad ones found doors politely closed. The strangest part? Victorians broke their own rules constantly, just very quietly. Gossip, the forbidden fruit of polite society, thrived in whispers behind fans or in corners of parlors while someone at the piano played something somber. Everyone claimed to despise gossip, yet everyone indulged in it, because behind all the decorum, curiosity was irresistible, and if you could phrase gossip delicately enough, it no longer counted as gossip. It was simply an observation. This entire conversational ecosystem worked because everyone agreed to pretend that they weren't judging, to pretend they weren't being judged, to pretend that their carefully chosen sentences just happened to be perfectly balanced. Conversation wasn't merely communication, it was social survival. And this rule linked seamlessly to the next. Because once you mastered what to say and how to say it, there was a crucial final ingredient: where you said it. Certain rooms, certain events, and certain social moments demanded specific conversational styles. The Victorian world wasn't just a maze of rules, it was a maze of contexts. And if you chose the wrong words in the wrong place, well, that is an entirely different Victorian disaster. So let's step from the drawing room into the next environment, where a new set of invisible rules waited, just as strange, just as intricate, and just as unavoidable. And thus, the chain of Victorian expectations tightened further. The rule of the household. If mastering respectable conversation was the Victorian social initiation ritual, then mastering where that conversation occurred was the next test, and often the trickiest. Because in Victorian society, location wasn't just a backdrop. It was a silent referee, judging your every move. Every parlor, drawing room, garden path, dining hall, ballroom, and street corner had its own invisible script, complete with unspoken rules about who could be there, when they could be there, how long they could stay, and what they should be doing while there. You could be perfectly polite in the wrong room and still be socially doomed. The Victorians were architectural moralizers. Their homes were built like etiquette manuals. Each space had a purpose, a tone, and an appropriate version of yourself you were expected to activate the moment you stepped through the doorway. Think of it like a real-life video game with different zones, each with its own rules and level of difficulty. Only instead of monsters or puzzles, you were up against disapproving relatives and neighbors with nothing better to do than observe you like a museum artifact. Let's start with the drawing room, the social battlefield, where reputations were built or quietly dismantled. The drawing room was where guests were first received, where polite chatter floated like dust in the sunlight, and where everyone looked pleasantly comfortable while sitting on furniture that was absolutely not meant to be comfortable. But the drawing room's rules were clear. Keep it light, keep it pleasant, keep it surface level. Anything heavier than biscuit crumbs required relocation to a more respectable environment. Then there was the parlor, which, despite often looking nearly identical to the drawing room, had a different social temperature. Parlors were slightly more relaxed, but still far from casual. They were the stage for meaningful, but not too meaningful interactions, for members of the household or approved guests. If the drawing room was the public theater, the parlor was the rehearsal space. You could lean back in your chair a fraction more. You could sigh softly without causing alarm, but you still had to behave like someone who understood that other people were constantly evaluating you. Move beyond these front-facing rooms, and you encounter the dining room, its own universe entirely. Dining rooms were solemn places during meals. The rules multiplied here like Victorian children, which is to say, rapidly and with little explanation. Your posture mattered. Your handling of cutlery mattered. Your timing mattered. Even the volume at which you buttered your bread mattered. The dining room wasn't just for eating, it was for demonstrating your training. If someone dropped a spoon, everyone pretended not to notice while absolutely noticing. And then there was the ballroom, arguably the most dangerous room of all. The ballroom was a glittering, echoing arena of social strategy. You were expected to dance, but not too eagerly. Smile, but not too broadly. Display charm, but not too much charm. Or else someone's aunt would whisper about your forwardness. Everything was a test in the ballroom. Whom you danced with, how many times you danced, the order in which you danced, every step formed a narrative. One wrong partner and your whole season's reputation tilted sideways. No pressure, of course. But perhaps the most treacherous of all Victorian spaces was the garden path, a deceptively peaceful walkway where courting rituals unfolded beneath blooming flowers and strategically trimmed hedges. Courting in the Victorian era wasn't a private affair. It was a supervised chess game. The garden path was where future engagements began, ended, or quietly imploded. A couple strolling unsupervised was practically a newspaper headline waiting to happen. And even supervised strolling required proper distance, proper tone, and proper pacing. You couldn't walk too slowly. That suggested overly romantic intention. Too quickly? Coldness. Too conversational? Impropriety. Too quiet? Suspicion. The garden path was a gauntlet disguised as greenery. And then we reach the street, the most unpredictable space of all. Streets in Victorian cities were chaotic, noisy, muddy, and busy. But even there, rules governed movement, like invisible traffic signs. Women walked at a dignified pace, never rushing unless they wanted to seem improper. Men walked slightly ahead, but not too far ahead, unless they wanted to seem rude. No shouting, no laughing loudly, no attracting attention, unless you were a newspaper boy, in which case shouting was your job. Even crossing the street had guidelines. Timing, eye contact, and the avoidance of horse manure were all part of the dance. But here's where things get wonderfully contradictory. Despite all these location-based rules, Victorians adored building enormous houses with countless rooms, most of which no one actually used. If you've ever wondered why so many Victorian homes have strange little nooks, oddly shaped hallways, or rooms that seem to exist purely to confuse modern visitors, the answer is simple. Each room once had a specific social identity, and heaven forbid someone played the piano in the wrong room. That was the kind of scandal elderly relatives remembered for decades. Now, what linked all these spaces wasn't just etiquette. It was the Victorian belief that your environment shaped your behavior. A respectable person acted respectably because they surrounded themselves with respectable surroundings. The right room elevated you. The wrong room exposed you. And if that meant spending half your life rearranging furniture and ensuring your home reflected your social aspirations, well, that was simply good living. But this mania for place extended beyond the private home. Public venues, churches, theaters, train stations, gardens came with their own intricacies. The church demanded reverent silence. The theater demanded enthusiastic but controlled applause. The train station demanded that you look as though you traveled frequently, even if you could barely afford the fare. And public parks? Victorian parks were arenas for display of manners, fashion, class, and which family could walk the most gracefully without tripping on gravel. The deeper you went into Victorian life, the clearer it became. Every inch of space was a moral landscape. Being seen in the wrong place could damage your social fabric. Being seen in the right place at the right time could elevate it. And so people moved through their environments like actors changing sets, shifting behaviors based on where they stood. Which leads us directly, inevitably, to the next rule. Because once you understood how physical location controlled your behavior, there was another guiding force waiting to dictate how you navigated it: time. Victorians didn't just live in rooms, they lived in schedules. And that schedule was its own labyrinth of expectations. Understanding the rules of location only worked if you respected the rules of timing. And that's where the era's strangest routines came into play. Shall we step into the next rule? The rule of mourning. If Victorians worshipped anything more fiercely than social spaces, it was time. Not the poetic kind of time, sunsets, seasons, the gentle passing of years. No. Victorians loved scheduled time, regimented time, time that marched forward like a tidy row of soldiers in perfectly polished boots. Their world ran on clocks, bells, routines, and timetables so strict that even modern planners would raise an eyebrow. To the Victorians, time was morality. A disciplined person kept a disciplined schedule. A respectable household ran like a well-wound pocket watch. And a life lived off schedule? Well, that was practically an invitation for chaos, ruin, and perhaps even moral decay. Somewhere, a Victorian would be clutching their pearls at the mere suggestion. The day began early, painfully early, because sleeping late was considered a sign of laziness, indulgence, and possibly degeneracy. Respectable families had already dressed, prayed, and eaten a polite breakfast before most modern people have even opened one eye. The morning's tone was sober, quiet, and purposeful. Tasks were assigned. Servants moved briskly. Children practiced handwriting or arithmetic. Adults began their daily responsibilities. One thing did not happen: lounging. Lounging was for cats and questionable characters, and Victorians were determined to be neither. Breakfast itself followed a timetable so specific that if you missed the window, you essentially forfeited your right to eat politely until lunch. Meals weren't just meals, they were time checkpoints. Eating at the wrong hour suggested disorder. Disorder suggested insufficient moral fortitude. And insufficient moral fortitude, well, that was how families ended up at the bottom of society's gossip ladder. It all started with a poorly timed biscuit. Mid-morning had its own rituals: gentle reading, needlework, calls from neighbors. The famous Victorian calling hours allowed for social visits, but only within a strict time frame. Arrive too early and you seemed overeager. Arrive too late and you seemed rude. Arrive exactly on time? Congratulations, you barely met expectations. And let us not forget the calling card, the tiny slip of paper that served as proof that you respected the sacred schedule of social interaction. Forgetting your calling card was equivalent to showing up unannounced, carrying a tub of margarine and shouting. Afternoons were calmer but still structured. Women might entertain guests or attend to household management. Men often returned to business, reading, or affairs of the mind, or so they claimed. Children had lessons, supervised play, or walks with governesses. Even leisure was scheduled. A walk in the park? Yes, but only at proper strolling hours. Tea with friends? Acceptable, but only in the late afternoon slot recognized across the empire. Idling for pleasure? A dangerous concept. Idleness was the seed from which scandal grew, or so the etiquette manuals warned. Then came tea time, the holy hour. Tea time wasn't accidental, it wasn't spontaneous. It was a carefully timed ceremony of brewing, pouring, and nibbling small treats arranged with near scientific precision. Even the steam rising from the teacup seemed to obey Victorian order. One did not simply drink tea when one felt like it. The tea felt like you should feel grateful for being allowed to drink it. Evening was a cascade of time-based rituals. Dressing for dinner took ages because fashion demanded it. Dinner itself was an hours-long production, complete with courses, pauses, toasts, and impeccably timed conversation. After dinner came parlor activities, music, reading aloud, light conversation, but never too light, never too heavy. Always correctly timed between the opening of the evening and the arrival of bedtime. Bedtime. Victorians treated going to bed like a formal event. Nightwear was chosen with care, hair was pinned or braided according to age and marital status, prayers were said, candles were lit and extinguished with ritualistic seriousness. Bed wasn't merely rest, it was the final checkpoint of the day's moral ledger. A respectable Victorian did not simply collapse into bed. They prepared for sleep the way one might prepare for a civil ceremony. This rigid schedule wasn't confined to households. Cities themselves ran on timetables. Trains, omnibuses, and even bathhouses had strict hours. Shops opened and closed with military precision. Public events began at expected times because punctuality was a sign of refinement. People who ran late were publicly shamed through pointed glances, or, worse, the soft and disappointed sigh of a friend's elderly mother. Victorians feared that sigh. And then there were the long-term schedules, seasonal routines. Mourning periods, for example, followed exact lengths depending on the relation lost. Too short a mourning period? Cold-hearted. Too long? Morbid. Courtship had proper lengths. Engagements had their ideal durations. Even pregnancy had a socially acceptable timeline for public acknowledgement. If time didn't govern your daily movement, it governed your milestones. But the strangest rule of all was that Victorians seemed to assume that time was something humans could control through sheer discipline. They truly believed that sticking to strict schedules prevented chaos, societal, emotional, and personal. A respectable person was punctual. A respectable home followed routines. A respectable community honored the symphony of clocks ringing out across the city at regular intervals. And yet, time was the era's biggest contradiction. Factories demanded harsh schedules that workers could barely survive. Children in schoolrooms were timed so strictly that a wrong pause earned punishment. Train schedules unified the country, yet also created new anxieties about being late. The Victorian era was obsessed with keeping time, and equally obsessed with fearing its loss. But here is the real secret behind the rule. Victorians didn't fear time itself. They feared the appearance of wasting it. They feared looking unproductive, looking idle, looking undisciplined. Time, to them, was proof of character, and character was everything. Which brings us to the next inevitable rule. Because if schedules governed the hours of the day, then appearance governed the minutes of every interaction. A Victorian could follow every timetable perfectly, but if their outward presentation slipped, the entire facade crumbled. Time dictated when you lived. Appearance dictated how you lived. And the Victorians were relentless about both. Ready to move on? The rule of morality. Victorians prided themselves on knowing that life was a constant interplay of appearances and time. But they also knew that appearances alone were never enough. There was an entire layer of life that demanded behavioral mastery in public. A set of rules so intricate that breaking them, even accidentally, could transform a minor misstep into social catastrophe. If Chapter 6 taught you how to honor time, Chapter 7 shows why moving through the world with controlled composure was essential to survival in Victorian society. The streets themselves were arenas of judgment. A man stepping out with his coat buttoned incorrectly, a hat tipped at the wrong angle, or shoes dulled beyond acceptable reflection could invite disapproving stares or whispered commentary from passersby. It didn't matter if you were wealthy or influential. Anyone could be shamed for failing to adhere to the invisible, universally understood standards of public conduct. These were standards that existed not in law, but in the collective, watchful consciousness of society. In Victorian England, social law often carried sharper teeth than any statute. For women, public behavior was even more tightly regulated. Walking down a crowded street required the careful placement of feet, hands, and even glances. A woman's gaze, fleeting as it might be, could be interpreted in dozens of ways. Too much eye contact? Forward. Too little? Cold. Smiling at the wrong person? Improper. Smiling at no one? You appeared cold and detached. Each movement had to project restraint, elegance, and refinement. It was a performance designed to signal respectability without seeming rehearsed, a delicate balance few mastered without years of practice. Men, meanwhile, had their own set of expectations. Standing, walking, interacting, all were considered demonstrations of character. A gentleman could not simply cross the street. He must stride with purpose, projecting authority and composure while simultaneously avoiding overconfidence or arrogance. A handshake, casual glance, or extended nod could carry more meaning than an entire conversation, and any misstep risked appearing untrustworthy or uncultured. Even tipping a hat involved a complicated calculus: the proper angle, the correct hand, and the precise duration to ensure it conveyed respect without subservience. Public gatherings amplified the pressure. Markets, parks, and theaters were less intimate than parlors, but no less scrutinized. A parent walking a child through a park would be judged not only on the child's behavior, but on their own capacity to manage it with composure. Children were expected to follow exact standards of politeness, silence, and movement. A poorly behaved child reflected not on them, but on the family, often sparking whispers that could echo across social circles. Victorian society was merciless that way. The missteps of one individual could tarnish a family's entire reputation. Even the smallest interactions carried risk. Standing too close to someone in a queue could be interpreted as boldness. Avoiding contact could seem cold. Offering help could suggest superiority or imply criticism of someone else's weakness. Etiquette manuals provided diagrams of how to wait, how to approach, and even how to shift your weight from foot to foot. Victorian citizens treated mundane public activity as a stage, a constant audition for approval. The home, too, had its own labyrinth of public behavior rules, especially when hosting visitors. Parlors and drawing rooms were not just rooms, they were performance stages. Guests were carefully seated to maintain the appearance of order and social hierarchy. Conversations were orchestrated with precision. Compliments, anecdotes, and expressions of gratitude were carefully calibrated to convey politeness without tipping into over-familiarity. Even the act of offering tea or refreshments had hidden expectations. The host must pour evenly, offer first to the guest of highest status, and ensure that the beverage was neither too hot nor too weak. A single oversight could be remembered for decades as a sign of poor upbringing. Dining rituals intensified the scrutiny. The table was a microcosm of Victorian propriety, where posture, speech, and utensils dictated reputation. Elbows off the table, napkin in lap, fork and knife held just so, the dining table was less a place to eat and more a proving ground of composure. Speech during meals required perfect timing. Not too loud, not too soft, not too abrupt. Toasts demanded grace, but restraint was paramount. Laughter, too, had a narrow acceptable range, gentle, brief, and appropriately timed. Fail to respect these invisible norms, and you risked a minor scandal, a ripple that could travel far beyond the confines of the dining room. Church was another stage entirely. Here, silence, posture, and attention were forms of moral display. A rustling program, a cough, or a glance in the wrong direction could invite judgment as harsh as any public gossip. Sermons demanded respect, but expressions of personal devotion had to remain subtle. Even bowing, kneeling, or crossing oneself required careful attention to timing and alignment with societal expectations. One could not appear too fervent, yet too little attention suggested moral slackness. Public transportation imposed additional constraints. Trains and omnibuses were crowded, unpredictable, and utterly unsupervised by chaperones. Yet Victorians treated these spaces with the same exacting standards as private parlors. Eyes, posture, seating choices, and interaction with strangers were all calculated to maintain a veneer of propriety. Women often traveled with parasols and small bags, both tools to demarcate personal space and reinforce decorum. Men held their hats and walking sticks in ways that projected authority and discipline. Every movement was a signal to others that the traveler belonged in the world of respectability. Courtship continued to intersect with public behavior. Couples were expected to interact in the presence of family, friends, and strangers with meticulous restraint. A gentleman might escort a lady to the theater or park, but the distance he maintained, the angle of his gaze, and the tone of his voice all followed invisible protocols. One misjudged gesture could spark rumors or undermine months of carefully curated reputation. The more public the interaction, the higher the stakes. Even play had rules. Children were taught games that cultivated obedience and social awareness. A misstep during hopscotch or tag was an educational, social, and moral lesson. Boys and girls were monitored not only for physical skill, but for ability to follow unwritten societal scripts. Losing gracefully, showing restraint, and maintaining composure were as important as winning. By the end of a day, a Victorian had performed an astonishing number of micro-behaviors: calculated walks, precise gestures, measured speech, carefully modulated emotion. Every action reinforced their status, morality, and respectability. The mental load was immense. To modern eyes, the constant surveillance, both external and internal, might seem absurd, yet for the Victorians, it was survival. Reputation was currency, and public behavior was how it was earned, preserved, or destroyed. And yet, paradoxically, these restrictions also gave life structure. People knew where and how to move, what to say, and how to act. That structure created a form of predictability and stability, which was comforting in a rapidly industrializing world filled with uncertainty. The streets, parlors, and parks were like carefully choreographed stages. Individuals learned to navigate them with practiced finesse, turning daily existence into a performance art where mastery of conduct became a badge of honor. Public behavior, then, was not merely a matter of etiquette, it was the invisible architecture of society itself. It dictated alliances, maintained hierarchies, and ensured that individuals could function in a world where the slightest misstep had disproportionate consequences. In Victorian England, your public self was as carefully constructed as your home, wardrobe, or family tree. And once mastery of public behavior was achieved, or at least convincingly feigned, the final and most inescapable set of rules emerged: the rules governing privacy and secrecy. For in a society obsessed with appearances, there were things that simply could not be seen, and even fewer things that could ever be spoken. These hidden rules, unrecorded in etiquette manuals, controlled the private spheres where morality, propriety, and fear intersected most acutely. Step carefully, for the Victorian world of secrecy is next, and it is stranger, darker, and far more intricate than anything in public view. The rule of raising children. If Victorian public behavior was the performance, then privacy was the backstage, a world equally governed by rules, and often far stranger. Behind closed doors, the facade of respectability remained, but it coexisted with secrets, anxieties, and rituals invisible to casual observers. Privacy was not simply about shutting doors. It was a structured, morally loaded, and highly performative space where even solitude carried expectations. To mismanage one's private life could be as socially ruinous as a public faux pas. In a respectable Victorian household, private quarters were organized with meticulous attention to hierarchy. The drawing room and parlor were the showrooms. Bedrooms, studies, and servants' quarters were functional spaces, but still bound by etiquette. Even the act of moving from one private room to another required consideration. Women often carried fans, gloves, or reticules, not just for style, but as social armor in spaces where family oversight lingered. Men, too, followed unspoken rules. Hat placement, coat arrangement, and posture were all carefully managed. A poorly folded jacket or an untied boot could hint at carelessness or moral laxity. Bedrooms were especially codified. Beds were not merely for rest, they were instruments of discipline. Sheets, Quilts and pillows were arranged precisely. Bedtime routines involved ritualized washing, dressing, and prayers. Sleep itself was performative. Even in private, a Victorian adult could not entirely abandon composure. Nighttime misbehavior, such as staying up too late reading sensational novels or scribbling inappropriate thoughts in diaries, risked internalized guilt that would ripple into daily conduct. Private indiscretions might never be seen by others, but they were monitored by conscience, a stern, invisible chaperone. Then came the peculiar Victorian obsession with moral hygiene. This extended to personal spaces and private habits alike. Bathrooms, rarely luxurious, were spaces of extreme discretion. Even cleaning one's body followed strict temporal and ritualistic rules. Bathing was rarely casual. It was a ceremony of purification, timed to ensure propriety, and even then accompanied by modesty and restraint. The water temperature, the order of washing, and the use of towels all carried subtle expectations. To mismanage these rituals could imply slovenliness, and slovenliness was considered dangerously close to moral laxity. Even closets and wardrobes were subject to regulation. Clothing was not merely fashion, it was moral statement. Private dress conveyed status, temperament, and intention. Undergarments, especially for women, were tightly structured. Corsets were laced with near military precision. Changing in front of another person, even a family member, was governed by strict decency rules. A misplacement of lace or accidental exposure was socially and emotionally catastrophic. Privacy existed not as freedom, but as a continuation of the same strict codes, applied invisibly behind locked doors. Servants were both enforcers and witnesses. Their duties included maintaining these private spaces in accordance with household standards. The upper classes relied on servants not only to clean and organize, but to ensure that moral and aesthetic order persisted in bedrooms, studies, and dressing areas. The presence of servants ensured that even private life adhered to the broader performance of respectability. Paradoxically, this meant that solitude was never entirely solitary. Observation was constant, whether obvious or subliminal. Correspondence in private was another arena of coded rules. Letters, journals, and notes were expected to reflect moral restraint, eloquence, and social awareness. Private thoughts could be written, but with care. Too casual, and they risked revealing impropriety. Too frank, and they risked embarrassment if discovered. Diaries were particularly peculiar. They were sanctuaries for unspoken truths, but they were also vulnerable. A dropped diary, or an inquisitive servant, could transform intimate musings into social scandal. Secrecy, therefore, required both discipline and foresight. Privacy, the Victorians knew, was only as safe as one's vigilance. Even relationships in private were regimented. Marriage did not dissolve the rules, it intensified them. Husbands and wives maintained structured interactions behind closed doors. Affection existed, but only in controlled, socially intelligible expressions. Touch, speech, and time spent together were constrained by expectations. Passion was permissible, but always bound within a framework of moral observance. Children, if present, were taught early to navigate these rhythms, absorbing subtle lessons in propriety and the performance of intimacy. And yet, the strangest part of Victorian privacy was the management of secrets, both personal and collective. Families maintained elaborate systems of concealment. Illnesses were whispered about, financial struggles hidden, and personal failings disguised behind carefully curated appearances. Servants often became unwitting keepers of these secrets, learning more about their employers' private lives than the family might admit. Secrets were currency, power, and potential catastrophe all at once. The wrong person discovering the wrong thing could ripple through society with lasting consequences. Some rules extended to mental and emotional conduct in private. Even thoughts required regulation. Intellectual curiosity, emotional indulgence, or romantic fantasy were constrained by propriety. Too much indulgence risked moral corruption, according to contemporary guides. People disciplined themselves through reading appropriate literature, journaling approved topics, and maintaining calm composure in isolation. In essence, privacy became another arena for performance, a rehearsal for public life. The Victorians also developed rituals around mourning and grief, which blended private emotion with societal expectation. Bereavement was not a spontaneous process. It was a ritualized practice with strict timelines, proper attire, and controlled behavior. Even in private, mourning was governed. Excessive display was unseemly. Insufficient acknowledgement of loss was morally suspect. Families conducted internal audits of grief, ensuring that sorrow adhered to socially acceptable standards. Candles were lit, letters written, and wardrobes changed, all as part of private compliance with public morality. Sexuality, the most intimate form of privacy, was similarly regulated. Discussions of desire, intimacy, or bodily matters were suppressed, veiled in euphemisms, and often coded in literature or conversation. Even married couples followed strict decorum in private. Sex was acceptable as a duty or natural function, but never as public discourse. The unspoken rule was that sexual matters existed quietly behind closed doors, performed with precision, discretion, and often guilt-infused reverence. To fail in this was to risk moral condemnation, both internal and social. Privacy, in short, was not freedom. It was an extension of public expectation, a domain where vigilance never ceased. The rules governing solitude, bedrooms, letters, emotions, and secrets were as intricate as those of dining rooms, drawing rooms, or garden paths, and the greatest paradox remained. The more meticulously a Victorian controlled their private life, the more public it became. Private discipline reflected character. Failure to maintain it whispered scandal. There was no escape from performance, no hiding from morality. Yet, despite this rigid framework, some Victorians managed subtle rebellions. Private humor, clandestine reading, whispered affection, or small acts of disobedience became personal sanctuaries. Diaries sometimes captured ironic reflections or sarcastic observations. Children found hidden corners to play freely. Lovers discovered ways to express emotions subtly, without violating social codes. These small deviations were carefully calibrated, tolerated, and sometimes celebrated in private, offering glimpses of humanity within the machinery of constraint. Ultimately, Victorian privacy was a paradox, a world where freedom was illusory, yet necessity made it profoundly creative. Behind every closed door was a performance, an invisible audit, and a negotiation between desire and propriety. It was a stage without audience applause, where character was judged silently, and mistakes could haunt both the self and the social world. To navigate this realm successfully required intelligence, cunning, restraint, and patience, the very qualities that defined the era's concept of respectability. And so, with mastery of public spaces, schedules, and private conduct, the Victorian individual emerged as a marvel of controlled adaptation. Every glance, step, gesture, and thought contributed to a lifetime of performance. But control, like all things, was only meaningful when juxtaposed against moments of subtle rebellion, hidden humor, or secret indulgence. Without the possibility of constraint being broken, Victorian life would have been dull, predictable, and joyless. Next, we move from these invisible rules to one of the strangest domains of all, Victorian fashion and personal presentation, where the obsession with appearances reached its most extreme, often ridiculous, and sometimes painful expressions. The rule of class. If privacy was the stage behind the curtain, then fashion and personal presentation were the costumes everyone had to wear, literally. In Victorian England, clothing was never just clothing. It was a signal, a performance, a declaration of morality, wealth, and character. Every corset, cravat, bustle, and boot carried meaning, and wearing the wrong style, or wearing it incorrectly, was socially unforgivable. Fashion was not about self-expression. It was about survival. Women's clothing, especially, resembled a complicated architectural blueprint more than simple attire. Corsets were the cornerstone, designed to shape the body into the era's ideal of refined elegance. But these devices were not just decorative, they were instruments of control. Tight lacing was meant to discipline posture, encourage a modest chest, and literally train the body to conform to society's aesthetic expectations. A poorly laced corset suggested carelessness. A too loosely laced corset hinted at moral slackness. No one, of course, admitted that the constriction was physically painful. To do so was improper. Complaints about discomfort were whispered privately or ignored entirely because propriety demanded silence. Bustles and layered skirts added another level of absurdity. Women walked, sat, and even ascended staircases with structures under their dresses that altered movement, gait, and perception. Each fold, drape, and layer communicated social class and taste. A skirt that was too plain suggested poverty or frugality. A skirt that was too ornate suggested vanity or impropriety. Color mattered. Fabrics mattered, accessories mattered, and let us not forget gloves, fans, parasols, and bonnets, all tools for signaling virtue, restraint, and fashionable awareness. Men's attire, though simpler in silhouette, carried an equally complex code. Tailcoats, waistcoats, cravats, top hats, and polished shoes were not mere fashion. They were a declaration of social standing, financial stability, and moral respectability. A misaligned cravat suggested carelessness. Scuffed shoes suggested negligence. An ill-fitting coat suggested either poverty or incompetence. Men were judged as harshly as women, but the rules were subtly different. Masculine fashion demanded authority, composure, and restraint. Bright colors or flamboyant patterns were frowned upon, except in carefully sanctioned circumstances. The man who dared defy these norms risked ridicule, exclusion, or gossip that could follow him like a shadow for years. And then there were the extremes, the rituals that pushed clothing from adornment into absurdity. Evening dress for women involved multiple layers of undergarments, corsets, crinolines, and bodices, all designed to create a seamless illusion of elegance. Dressing was a full-length event, often assisted by maids, mothers, or sisters. Even the act of stepping into shoes required careful thought, positioning, tightness, alignment. A misplaced shoe strap could ruin an entire presentation. For men, evening dress demanded precision, cufflinks correctly fastened, collars starched, waistcoats buttoned in exact order. Sloppiness was unforgivable. Footwear, in particular, was a minefield. Boots for women often had pointed toes and high laces, making walking precarious. A stumble could be seen as metaphorical as well as literal, improperly navigating society. Men's boots were polished to a mirror finish, reflecting not just light, but discipline. A dull shoe or scuffed toe was evidence of negligence in character, not just hygiene. In short, shoes were moral statements. Hair and headwear followed equally bizarre codes. Women's hair was bound, braided, or coiled into elaborate structures, often requiring pins, combs, and hidden supports. A loose strand suggested either carelessness or flirtation. Men's hair, while simpler, demanded regular grooming and sometimes styling with waxes or pomades. Hats were not optional, they were signals. Removing a hat indoors was permitted only under precise circumstances, and leaving it tilted incorrectly could invite commentary or a scandalous whisper. Jewelry served the dual purpose of decoration and communication. Brooches, lockets, and rings were not simply adornments. They conveyed wealth, family allegiance, and subtle romantic messages. Certain stones suggested mourning. Certain arrangements implied engagement or affection. Wearing jewelry incorrectly, or at the wrong time, was a breach of social intelligence. Victorian society might have tolerated a minor slip in conversation, but a fashion misstep could signal incompetence, impropriety, or moral failure. Children, too, were caught in these rules from birth. Boys wore short trousers, waistcoats, and little jackets, all designed to signal proper grooming, social standing, and future potential. Girls wore dresses that mimicked adult styles in miniature, complete with corsets and frilly layers. Even infants were dressed according to strict social norms, ensuring that propriety began before comprehension. The message was clear. One's appearance was never innocent. It was always a declaration, a signal, a test. Fashion extended to funerary rituals. Mourning attire, for example, followed exact specifications. Widows were expected to wear black for a prescribed period, with specific fabrics and accessories. Shortened periods, faded materials, or even subtle deviations were noticed and discussed, often interpreted as a reflection of emotional depth or moral failure. Widowers, though slightly freer, still faced strict expectations for black suits, hats, and gloves. Mourning fashion was less about grief and more about social signaling, a visual contract declaring that one adhered to society's rules, even in sorrow. Even leisure and travel required conformity. Sporting events, seaside vacations, and walks in the park came with specific attire rules. Swimsuits, walking suits, and carriage clothing were carefully regulated to avoid impropriety. A woman exposing too much ankle, even by accident, risked a minor scandal. Men wearing a hat backwards or a coat too short could invite gossip and judgment. Public outings, therefore, were performances as exacting as private salons or dinner tables. The strangest aspect of Victorian fashion was its absurd dedication to pain as morality. Tight corsets, heavy skirts, uncomfortable boots, stiff collars, and tight gloves were not incidental. They were deliberate, signaling self-discipline, endurance, and moral rectitude. The message was clear. If you could suffer silently for beauty and propriety, you could handle the rigors of social life and moral expectation. Fashion was pain made visible, and visible pain equaled virtue. And yet, as with so many Victorian rules, contradictions abounded. While clothing restricted movement and enforced discipline, it also became a site of subtle rebellion. Hidden pockets, secret fastenings, and small personal accessories allowed individuals to maintain a tiny private sphere within the confines of societal expectation. Jewelry could carry sentimental value. Fabrics could be secretly chosen for comfort or style. Hats could conceal a smirk or signal a private joke. Fashion, like privacy, allowed tiny rebellions while maintaining the overall performance. Ultimately, Victorian fashion was a language, and learning it was a matter of survival. Every layer, stitch, and accessory communicated meaning, social standing, marital status, moral fiber, respectability, and even personal ambition. To ignore this language was not just unwise, it was dangerous. But to master it, paradoxically, allowed a certain freedom within the strictures of society. Understanding the rules of dress and when to break them discreetly gave Victorians a private satisfaction that coexisted with public performance. And so, having examined the rules of space, time, public behavior, privacy, and now fashion, we begin to understand the astonishingly intricate web of Victorian life. Every movement, every glance, every stitch, and every second was regulated. Life was a performance, yet it was lived with sincerity, humor, and an occasional wink behind the curtain. Next, we will explore Victorian entertainment and leisure, where rules collided with creativity, absurdity, and the strange rituals of public amusement that tested both restraint and imagination. The rule of work. If Victorian life was a symphony of rules, then entertainment and leisure were the interludes that allowed both conformity and subtle rebellion to coexist. Yet even amusement was governed by invisible scripts. The Victorians did not simply play in the modern sense. Play, recreation, and cultural engagement were carefully calibrated performances, full of expectation, restraint, and, paradoxically, opportunities to flaunt social intelligence. In the Victorian worldview, how you enjoyed yourself was just as important as how you lived every other moment of your life. The theater was the apex of public amusement. A trip to the play was more than seeing a performance, it was a social showcase. Seating was determined by class and status, with boxes and front rows reserved for the elite. Audience behavior was strictly controlled. Whistling, shouting, or laughing too loudly could destroy reputations. Applause had a prescribed form, measured, polite, and timed to avoid appearing crude. The choice of theater, even the particular play, communicated knowledge, taste, and social alignment. A poor choice suggested ignorance or bad upbringing. A brilliant one demonstrated intelligence and refinement. And the stage itself reflected society. Elaborate costumes, carefully arranged scenery, and formalized scripts mirrored the very social structure in which the audience was trapped. Musical entertainment followed similar rules. Parlors often hosted evening concerts, where amateur musicians, mostly women, performed pieces from memory or sheet music. The performance was both a display of skill and adherence to propriety. A mistake could be quietly excused, but excessive errors hinted at carelessness or lack of discipline. Listeners, seated with perfect posture and polite attention, evaluated every note, gesture, and expression. Music, in the Victorian context, was therefore a dual-purpose activity, an artistic pursuit and a test of decorum. Games and indoor recreation carried their own peculiar expectations. Card games, chess, and board games were common in parlors, but rules extended beyond gameplay. Players were judged on behavior as much as skill. Cheating, arguing, or displaying frustration was morally and socially unacceptable. Even a casual victory demanded humility. Losing gracefully, meanwhile, became a subtle display of character. Leisure, therefore, was never truly leisure. It was another arena to demonstrate discipline, intelligence, and refinement. Outdoor recreation was equally fraught with social codes. Gardens, parks, and promenades were stages for display. Walking was a carefully choreographed activity. Pace, posture, proximity to companions, and even glances had social meaning. Tennis courts, croquet lawns, and boating excursions were opportunities to demonstrate physical skill, strategic thinking, and grace under observation. Even a misstep on a croquet mallet or an awkward move in a boat could become fodder for whispered commentary in the crowd. Public leisure, in other words, was always a performance, but one with higher stakes than private amusement. Seaside vacations and day trips introduced another layer of absurdity. Coastal resorts were crowded, noisy, and heavily surveilled social spaces. Fashion rules clashed with comfort. Women in layered bathing suits and stiff hats, men in full suits even in heat. Everyone navigating sand, waves, and social scrutiny. Simple acts like wading into water or strolling along the promenade required judgment and calculation. Were you too visible? Too playful? Too idle? Every move could be observed and interpreted, creating a subtle tension between enjoyment and propriety. Balls and dances were perhaps the most intricate venues for entertainment. These were events where social skill, physical coordination, and appearance merged into a single performance. Dancing required knowledge of formal patterns, proper gestures, and rhythmic timing. A man could not simply ask a woman to dance without observing hierarchy, prior introductions, and family alliances. Women needed to master the art of polite acceptance or rejection, all without appearing rude or forward. A misstep on the floor or a social misjudgment could reverberate across the season, affecting courtship, reputation, and marriage prospects. Even reading and literature were forms of entertainment governed by moral and social rules. Novels, periodicals, and newspapers were expected to reflect proper taste and refinement. Certain books were considered morally dangerous or inappropriate, especially for women and children. Reading habits were scrutinized. Public discussion of literature required knowledge of appropriate commentary, avoiding scandalous or controversial topics. Enjoyment was permitted, but always within bounds of social decency. In essence, even private intellectual entertainment was a moral performance. Children's entertainment was similarly regimented. Dolls, miniature furniture, and games were tools for socialization. Play emphasized skill, discipline, and observation. Children learned to cooperate, compete politely, and understand social hierarchies, all under the guise of amusement. Free, chaotic play was rare. Even leisure was structured, a rehearsal for adult social expectations. Victorians also embraced unusual or bizarre amusements that seem absurd today. such as phrenology exhibitions, penny readings, or chemical demonstrations. Attending these events allowed the socially curious to signal sophistication, bravery, or scientific interest. Yet, even here, rules applied. Fascination could be indulged only to the extent that it didn't appear frivolous or inappropriate. Enthusiasm without control was a moral liability, just as indifference could suggest ignorance. The interplay of entertainment, leisure, and social performance highlights a central paradox of Victorian life. Pleasure was simultaneously expected, constrained, and morally coded. Recreation was not just for joy. It was a way to demonstrate intelligence, restraint, and refinement. Every laugh, glance, movement, or reaction became part of a larger social narrative, carefully read and interpreted by everyone in view. Yet within these rigid structures, creativity and subtle rebellion emerged. Secret jokes, hidden expressions of amusement, clever improvisations in games, or unspoken flirtation allowed individuals to negotiate the rules without fully breaking them. Leisure became a testing ground for ingenuity. The more rules one could navigate or bend subtly, the more socially skilled one appeared. Entertaining oneself and others became an exercise in cunning, diplomacy, and emotional intelligence. Ultimately, Victorian leisure demonstrates that even pleasure was inseparable from performance. Fun existed, yes, but it required discipline, awareness, and skill. Entertainment was both a social mirror and a proving ground, where the lessons of propriety, observation, and subtle manipulation were reinforced. Success was measured not just in enjoyment, but in the artful negotiation of social expectation. And just as the rules of space, time, privacy, and fashion had their strict dictates, so too did leisure impose its own invisible constraints. Step incorrectly, laugh too loudly, or linger too long in the wrong place, and gossip would swiftly fill the void. Step carefully, observe, and maneuver with grace, and you not only survived, you thrived. The next chapter will examine Victorian food and dining etiquette, where absurdity, discipline, and performance converge over every course, bite, and sip, demonstrating how even sustenance was moralized and meticulously regulated. The rule of social events. If Victorian life was a theater, then dining was its most meticulously staged act. Every meal, from a humble breakfast to a grand dinner, was a performance of wealth, refinement, and moral virtue. Eating was not a private indulgence. It was a public declaration, even if the audience consisted solely of family or a few guests. The rules were exhaustive, unrelenting, and often bizarre, ensuring that every bite, sip, and gesture conveyed the proper message. Breakfast was an exercise in subtlety. Served early in the morning, it demanded both punctuality and propriety. The choice of tea, coffee, or chocolate was significant. Too strong a brew suggested coarseness. Too weak implied carelessness. Toast had to be perfectly browned, jam carefully spread, and cutlery precisely positioned. Conversation at breakfast was light, polite, and non-controversial. Humor was allowed, but only in controlled doses. One ill-timed dose could shadow the day with disapproval. The Victorian breakfast table was, in essence, an audition, a way to display discipline, awareness, and social skill before the world fully awakened. Lunch, often modest compared to dinner, was similarly regulated. It was usually taken in semi-private settings, allowing families to demonstrate their adherence to propriety without the scrutiny of guests. Still, even here, appearances mattered. Servants maintained strict order, ensuring that dishes were served in the correct sequence and temperature. Every movement of the host or hostess communicated competence, taste, and moral uprightness. A misaligned plate or an overheard complaint could signify moral weakness, laziness, or poor breeding. Dinner was the grand spectacle. Evening meals were elaborate, multi-course affairs where the tiniest misstep could carry severe social consequences. Place settings were arranged with obsessive precision. Forks, knives, spoons, and glasses followed specific patterns depending on course and rank. Each utensil had a purpose, and using it incorrectly was a sin of etiquette. Bread was torn, never cut. Soup consumed quietly with subtle slurps. Meat carved in careful strokes. Every movement required consideration of optics, timing, and propriety. Conversation at the dinner table was an art form. Polite discussion was encouraged, but only within strict boundaries. Politics could be mentioned, but radical ideas were taboo. Humor was allowed, but had to be witty without vulgarity. Compliments had to be sincere, yet measured. Silence was permissible, but prolonged silence risked awkwardness. Guests and hosts alike were judged not just on what they said, but on how they said it, the timing of their words, and even the cadence of their laughter. The dinner table was a battlefield where intelligence, wit, and discipline were displayed simultaneously. Beverages were no less regulated. Tea, coffee, and wine were chosen and poured according to social expectations. The temperature, strength, and order of service were scrutinized. A mispoured cup could signal incompetence. A sip taken too quickly suggested impatience. Too slowly, indecision. Wine toasts required careful phrasing and timing. Improperly lifted glasses or incorrect eye contact during toasts could provoke subtle but scathing commentary. In Victorian dining, even a sip of water was morally charged. Children's participation in meals was similarly staged. They were expected to emulate adult manners, but with careful observation. Improper posture, mispronounced words, or sloppy utensil use reflected poorly on the family. Table training began early, often under the watchful eye of governesses or parents. Mealtime was both instruction and performance. By mastering etiquette, children learned social hierarchy, self-discipline, and how to navigate the moral universe of Victorian society. Desserts and sweets were particularly revealing. Sugar was expensive, and the careful distribution of treats reflected status, generosity, and refinement. Overindulgence suggested greed or a lack of control. Refusal hinted at poor upbringing or a lack of appreciation. Even the placement of fruit, pastries, and confections required consideration. A dessert served hastily, at the wrong time, or with improper garnish could damage a host's reputation as thoroughly as a poorly prepared entree. Food preparation itself followed its own invisible rules. Kitchens were spaces of strict order, discipline, and hierarchy. Recipes were followed to the letter, utensils kept spotless, and servants trained to anticipate every need. Even the handling of leftovers was regulated. Wastefulness was a moral failure. The household's reputation was partially baked, boiled, or roasted into each dish. Cooking was both art and morality play, ensuring that sustenance reflected respectability as much as nourishment. Dining rituals extended to public spaces as well. Restaurants, hotels, and clubs were arenas where social observation intensified. Table manners, conversation, and even the order of consumption were scrutinized. Those unfamiliar with local etiquette risked embarrassment or subtle humiliation. A gentleman or lady might be judged for improper posture, incorrect cutlery use, or failing to engage politely with others. Public dining was a high-stakes exercise in social navigation, reinforcing the pervasive Victorian obsession with image and propriety. Even special occasions had heightened expectations. Banquets, weddings, and formal celebrations transformed dining into spectacle. Men and women dressed in their finest, tables were arranged with elaborate floral displays, and every dish was meticulously planned. The combination of cuisine, appearance, and conversation created a performance that could cement social alliances or ignite scandal. A single misstep, wrong utensil, poorly timed toast, or over-enthusiastic laughter could echo for months, remembered and whispered in drawing rooms long after the event. The obsession with ritual also extended to dietary restrictions and morality. Victorians believed that what one consumed reflected character. Excessive indulgence implied weakness. Refusal of offered dishes suggested austerity or disapproval. Even the choice between beef, fish, or vegetables carried social meaning. Meals were moral landscapes, where the body, mind, and reputation intersected. Eating poorly, or eating improperly, was not merely a culinary mistake. It was a lapse in virtue, discipline, and intelligence. Tea rituals, as previously mentioned, were miniature performances in themselves. Afternoon tea required precision, exact timing, correct placement of cups, and selection of accompaniments. Scones had to be split properly, jam applied discreetly, and conversation conducted lightly yet engagingly. Guests and hosts alike were evaluated on their adherence to these subtle rules. The smallest lapse, spilling cream, mispronouncing the name of a cake, or overreaching for sugar, could mark one as uncultured or socially inept. Ultimately, Victorian dining reveals a world where sustenance was inseparable from morality, social skill, and performance. Every meal, from breakfast to banquet, reinforced lessons about observation, discipline, hierarchy, and subtle control. The act of eating was never purely biological. It was an exercise in intelligence, restraint, and navigation of invisible moral and social codes. To survive and thrive at the Victorian table, one needed a mastery of timing, posture, conversation, and presentation that rivals the demands of modern diplomacy. And yet, even within this strict framework, small rebellions occurred. A cheeky remark, a hidden second helping, or a whispered joke among family members could provide private amusement, a tiny crack in the armor of rigidity. These moments of subversion remind us that beneath the layers of discipline, performance, and morality, human nature persisted. The Victorian obsession with rules was totalizing, yes, but never entirely suppressive. Having examined dining and etiquette, the next chapter will explore Victorian courtship and marriage, a domain where rules, appearances, and private desires collided with remarkable intensity, creating some of the strangest and most elaborate rituals of the era. The rule of public life. If Victorian dining was a carefully staged drama, then courtship and marriage were the epic finales of social performance. These were the arenas where the rules of time, appearance, privacy, public behavior, fashion, leisure, and dining all converged into a single high-stakes theater. To navigate courtship successfully required intelligence, restraint, and an almost obsessive mastery of etiquette. Missteps were costly, not merely socially, but sometimes financially, as alliances and inheritances often hung on the smallest gestures. Courtship began with observation. Young men and women spent years learning the subtle signals of attraction, propriety, and intention. A glance could mean interest, or nothing at all. A smile could convey politeness or flirtation. Conversation was monitored for hints of intellect, wit, or moral fiber. The Victorian mind treated these interactions like puzzles. Every gesture, word, and pause carried layered meaning, and understanding the code was essential for survival in the marriage market. Letters were crucial in courtship. Written correspondence allowed expression without immediate judgment, but even here, rules governed every phrase. A gentleman's letter had to be respectful yet sincere, clever yet restrained. Too effusive, and it was desperate. Too terse, and it was cold. Young women's replies were equally calculated. A poorly crafted response could ruin prospects. A carefully worded one could charm and elevate social status. Ink, paper quality, and even handwriting were scrutinized, ensuring that private communication still reflected public morality. Introductions and social visits followed strict protocols. A young man could not simply approach a young lady uninvited. Proper channels had to be observed, often through family or trusted acquaintances. Calls were scheduled with precision, and the duration of visits mattered. Arrive too early or too late, linger too long, or depart too abruptly, each misstep could carry consequences. Even the choice of conversation topics had moral and social weight. Gossip, scandal, or impropriety could end a courtship before it began. Public behavior during courtship was fraught with complexity. Walks in parks, carriage rides, or theater attendance were opportunities for subtle signaling. Physical distance, posture, and conversation were all calculated. A gentleman might offer his arm, but only at the socially sanctioned moment. A lady might accept, but her hands, gloves, and fan had to communicate propriety, interest, or reserve. Flirtation existed, yes, but within a narrow, nearly invisible corridor. Cross it, and one risked scandal. Fail to cross it, and one risked indifference. Dancing was another stage for courtship. Balls and formal gatherings allowed potential couples to demonstrate grace, skill, and compatibility. Knowledge of dance steps, timing, and rhythm was essential. Missteps were noticed and remembered. Even seating arrangements and postures at the supper table following a dance were analyzed for meaning. Victorian society treated these dances like a chessboard. Every move had implications for alliances, reputation, and eventual marriage prospects. Chaperones played a critical role in maintaining moral standards. No courtship was complete without the vigilant eye of a parent, relative, or hired guardian. Their presence ensured that interactions remained within approved boundaries, and their judgment could be as decisive as any social law. Young couples learned to communicate subtly, using glances, gestures, and carefully chosen words to express interest while avoiding impropriety. Secrets were whispered under the watchful eyes of society, creating a tension between desire and discipline. Marriage itself was equally governed by rules. Engagements were formal, timed according to social norms, and often announced publicly to reinforce family alliances. The length of the engagement reflected class, circumstance, and moral expectation. Too short suggested impulsiveness, too long suggested indecision. Gifts, correspondence, and social acknowledgement were all carefully curated. A well-timed engagement solidified alliances and demonstrated adherence to societal expectations. Financial considerations were never far from courtship. A prospective husband's wealth, income, and family connections were scrutinized meticulously, often more so than character or personal compatibility. Dowries, inheritance, and property rights dictated much of the social calculus. Women, meanwhile, navigated a delicate balance between personal preference and familial expectation. A choice based purely on affection could be considered reckless, while a purely strategic choice risked emotional dissatisfaction. Love and practicality were intertwined, but always mediated through social rules. Courtship also had emotional and psychological dimensions. Restraint, patience, and self-control were paramount. Public displays of passion were forbidden. Private indulgence was closely monitored. Letters, notes, and subtle touches conveyed desire without violating propriety. The rules of restraint created tension, suspense, and anticipation, which Victorians considered morally uplifting. Emotional expression was allowed, but only in forms that demonstrated character, intelligence, and moral virtue. The home played a role in courtship, too. Visits were staged to showcase family respectability and adherence to social norms. House decor, cleanliness, and table presentation all contributed to the impression made on a visitor. The proper arrangement of furniture, flowers, and even seating order conveyed subtle messages about wealth, taste, and moral standing. A host or hostess could subtly influence courtship outcomes through these carefully orchestrated settings. Children, siblings, and extended family were rarely passive observers. Their behavior, attire, and manners could influence the perception of a potential match. Young women were expected to guide younger siblings, maintain composure, and demonstrate practical skills, all while avoiding impropriety. Young men needed to display leadership, courtesy, and discretion. The family unit itself became a stage, and the prospective couple were actors performing within it. Mourning, illness, and misfortune introduced additional complications. Victorian courtship required awareness of timing, sensitivity, and propriety. Visiting during illness, acknowledging grief, or navigating family tragedy demanded tact, empathy, and judgment. Improper behavior could be interpreted as insensitivity or moral weakness. Courtship, therefore, was never isolated from the broader social context. It was enmeshed with every nuance of public and private life. Finally, Victorian courtship required mastery of secrecy. Private feelings, strategic decisions, and personal desires were all concealed beneath layers of decorum. Letters were hidden, whispered messages exchanged, and subtle signals deployed. This secrecy was both a necessity and a form of social entertainment. The thrill of hidden meaning, the art of subtle persuasion, and the tension of constrained desire were central to the courtship experience. In essence, Victorian courtship and marriage were the culmination of all previous rules. Time, appearance, privacy, behavior, fashion, leisure, and dining. To navigate this world successfully demanded intelligence, observation, subtlety, and discipline. Every glance, gesture, word, and choice could alter life trajectories, social standing, and family fortunes. Courtship was a theater, and the stakes could not have been higher. Next, we will explore Victorian health, hygiene, and the obsession with moralized medicine, a domain where rules, fear, and absurdity combined in ways that were often painful, bizarre, and darkly humorous. The rule of technology and change. If Victorian life was a performance, then health, hygiene, and medicine were the ever-present backstage machinery, complicated, peculiar, and occasionally terrifying. In a society obsessed with moral virtue, disease was not just a physical threat, it was often interpreted as a reflection of character, cleanliness, and social discipline. Illnesses were monitored, managed, and moralized, creating a culture in which fear, ritual, and absurdity intertwined in daily life. Hygiene, for instance, was paradoxically obsessive and inconsistent. Soap and water were embraced by the wealthy, yet the concept of full-body bathing was still limited by space, cost, and prevailing beliefs. Morning and evening routines involved careful cleansing of hands and face, but full baths were sometimes rare, considered indulgent, or even dangerous to health, according to some medical authorities. Cleanliness was moral as much as physical. One's appearance and scent broadcast virtue, discipline, and self-respect. Neglect implied moral laxity, sloth, or even a hidden vice. Public perceptions of illness were equally strict. Smallpox, cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis were rampant, yet they were also laden with social judgment. Victorians often assumed that disease reflected personal failings. An unclean home, improper diet, or excessive indulgence could mark someone for moral scrutiny alongside physical vulnerability. Fear of contagion extended beyond practical measures. It shaped social behavior, interactions, and even courtship. Visiting the sick was governed by etiquette. Approach too closely, and you appeared reckless. Keep too far away, and you appeared callous. Medical care itself was both advanced and bizarre by modern standards. Doctors relied on bleeding, purging, leeches, and mercury, often in rigidly scheduled regimens. Remedies were frequently painful, messy, or toxic, yet adherence was seen as virtuous. Patients were expected to comply silently and diligently, demonstrating moral fortitude alongside physical endurance. Complaining was socially unacceptable. Suffering was noble. The concept of patient autonomy was minimal. Obedience was mandatory, and failure implied weakness or a deficient moral character. Hygiene extended to clothing and bedding. Underwear, linens, and nightclothes were washed meticulously, often with elaborate systems of boiling, airing, and bleaching. The Victorians believed that cleanliness could prevent disease, moral corruption, and social disgrace. A soiled sheet or unwashed garment was more than uncomfortable, it was a social and spiritual failure. Even children were trained from infancy to participate in these rituals, absorbing the lesson that bodily care was inseparable from moral discipline. Diet was a major component of health, and it was heavily moralized. Overeating was considered a vice. Indulgence in sweets or alcohol indicated weak character. Meals were designed not just for sustenance, but for moral instruction. Foods were believed to influence temperament, intellect, and even spiritual well-being. Recipes were followed not only for taste, but for health and virtue, linking every bite to morality. Eating improperly or consuming forbidden foods risked not only physical discomfort, but social disapproval. Exercise, too, was moralized. Walking, riding, and early forms of gymnastics were encouraged, but always within socially sanctioned bounds. Overexertion, improper attire, or excessive leisure could imply indiscipline. Physical activity was performed with an eye toward appearance, composure, and moral benefit. Even children's play was subtly regimented, blending amusement with instruction in endurance, propriety, and social hierarchy. The body, in Victorian thought, was both a temple and a stage for moral display. The obsession with germs and disease was both rational and absurd. Emerging understandings of bacteria and contagion led to widespread fear of public spaces, clothing, and bodily fluids. Hand washing was recommended but inconsistently practiced. Public sanitation lagged behind knowledge. Public health campaigns often combined scientific advice with moral admonition, warning that careless hygiene could corrupt society, destroy marriages, or ruin reputations. Fear of contamination shaped architecture, clothing, and urban life, creating bizarre rituals in even ordinary interactions. Sleep was similarly regulated. Nighttime routines demanded discipline, with strict schedules for rising, retiring, and even napping. Overindulgence in sleep was seen as laziness. Too little was morally suspect, suggesting weak character or poor management of one's body. Bedtime was both practical and moral, reinforcing societal values of order, control, and self-regulation. Bedrooms were spaces of ritualized hygiene, carefully monitored even in private. Medical examinations themselves were socially and psychologically loaded. Physicians, usually men, inspected patients with strict protocols. Invasive procedures, bleeding, or purgatives were administered with little patient input, justified by the belief that obedience reflected virtue. Privacy existed, but only partially. Modesty was expected, but adherence to medical advice was paramount. The patient's character was evaluated alongside physical symptoms, merging morality with medicine in ways that could feel intrusive or absurd by modern standards. Quackery and home remedies were also widespread, providing both relief and comedic absurdity. Patent medicines promised miraculous cures, but often contained dangerous ingredients: opium, alcohol, or arsenic. Despite the risks, adherence to these remedies was socially reinforced. Failing to administer proper treatments could suggest ignorance, neglect, or moral weakness. Advertisements, pamphlets, and household guides instructed families on proper compliance, blending fear, ritual, and consumerism in ways that were uniquely Victorian. Mental health was similarly moralized and misunderstood. Conditions like melancholia, hysteria, or nervous disorders were often treated as moral failings or evidence of weak character. Treatments ranged from the bizarre to the brutal. Rest cures, isolation, or sensory deprivation were common. Yet compliance with these measures was interpreted as evidence of discipline and virtue. Expression of distress, conversely, could jeopardize social standing or suggest instability. Emotional regulation was not only expected, it was a moral requirement. Preventatism also carried ritualistic dimensions. Vaccinations, quarantines, and isolation measures were often intertwined with social judgment. Compliance demonstrated intelligence, civic responsibility, and moral awareness. Failure to follow rules, whether due to ignorance or negligence, could lead to both physical danger and public scorn. The boundaries between science, morality, and etiquette were blurred, creating a landscape in which health was inseparable from virtue, discipline, and social standing. Even funerary hygiene reflected the same concerns. Bodies were prepared with care, washed and dressed meticulously. Mourning rituals intersected with sanitation. Candles, flowers, and linens were used to manage both odor and appearance. Death, like life, was governed by rules, some practical, some symbolic, all socially significant. Proper adherence to these rules demonstrated moral and social competence even in grief. The Victorian obsession with health, hygiene, and medicine illustrates the era's intricate interplay between fear, morality, and absurdity. Every action, washing hands, choosing food, resting, or taking remedies, was morally coded, socially monitored, and often physically taxing. Life itself was a performance in which the body became both a tool of morality and a stage for social judgment. Pain, discomfort, and ritual were tolerated because they reinforced virtue, discipline, and social reputation. Yet beneath these strictures, small acts of rebellion and creativity persisted. Secret indulgences, humorous commentaries on remedies, hidden cigarettes, or clandestine games of skill allowed Victorians to negotiate the rigidity of health rules while maintaining outward propriety. Medicine, like fashion and leisure, provided both constraint and an opportunity for subtle subversion. The rule of legacy. If Victorian life was a meticulously choreographed dance, then the strangest social rituals and taboos were the most intricate steps that everyone was expected to perform, yet few could master without appearing absurd. From peculiar customs surrounding greetings to elaborate rules governing grief, public behavior, and even bodily functions, the era was obsessed with regulation, appearances, and moral performance. In many ways, these rules were more controlling than law itself, dictating how one existed in the world from dawn to dusk, in private as well as public. Greetings were not simple gestures. A handshake, a bow, or a curt nod carried layers of social meaning. Distance, duration, and angle mattered. Too formal, and one appeared stiff or haughty. Too casual, and one seemed disrespectful. Women's handshakes were often light, delicate, and accompanied by averted glances, demonstrating both propriety and modesty. Men's grips were measured to convey strength without aggression. Even the act of removing gloves, a seemingly mundane gesture, was carefully staged. Gloves were moral instruments. Slipping them on or off at the wrong time could betray improper intention. Public manners extended to the minutiae of posture, walking, and gestures. The correct positioning of one's hat, the angle of a walking stick, or the tilt of the head could broadcast intelligence, respectability, or moral awareness. Posture was not mere vanity, it was a code. Slouching suggested indolence or poor breeding. Too rigid a stance implied artificiality or desperation. Walking in public spaces was a subtle negotiation. How closely to pass another pedestrian, whether to nod, smile, or avoid eye contact. All communicated social understanding or lack thereof. Even bodily functions were regulated by invisible rules. Coughing, sneezing, or yawning required precise timing and subtle gestures. A handkerchief was not optional, it was a symbol of self-control and morality. Failure to adhere to these protocols risked shame or gossip. Toilets, chamber pots, and bathrooms, while practical, were also governed by expectation. Privacy existed, yes, but so did moral oversight. Improper behavior in these spaces could become scandalous, especially for women. Social understanding of bodily control was as much about morality as health, reinforcing the Victorian obsession with discipline in every aspect of life. Mourning rituals were among the most elaborate and peculiar of all social expectations. The duration of grief, the color of clothing, the arrangement of flowers, and even the correct way to display mourning jewelry were codified. Widows, for example, were expected to wear black for months or even years, depending on social status. Deviations from these norms, shortened mourning periods, faded fabrics, or improper ornamentation could spark speculation about emotional resilience, moral character, or family allegiance. Even funerals were moral performances. The placement of candles, the sequencing of prayers, and the distribution of condolence notes reflected social precision. Courtship and social gatherings were arenas for the exercise of subtle manipulation. Etiquette dictated the order of conversation, the careful deployment of humor, and even the timing of laughter. Flirtation, while permitted, was codified, requiring awareness of hierarchy, propriety, and subtle signaling. Missteps could ruin reputations, while mastery of these rituals conferred prestige and influence. Dance floors, dinner tables, and even garden walks were stages where subtle social maneuvering became an art form, blending charm, intelligence, and strategic calculation. Odd rules extended to personal possessions. Chairs, hats, gloves, jewelry, and even books were governed by usage, display, and timing. Placement, visibility, and condition reflected character. A crooked chair could suggest carelessness, a scuffed book, ignorance, a missing glove, impropriety. Every item, like every gesture, communicated a moral message. The private and public spheres were inseparable in this moral theater. What one owned, how one wore it, and how one displayed it could enhance or damage reputation. Strange taboos existed regarding speech as well. Certain words, topics, or jokes were forbidden in polite company. Conversations about illness, money, or bodily matters required euphemisms or subtle avoidance. Humor was encouraged only if it adhered to wit, subtlety, and refinement. Too broad or vulgar a joke could ostracize participants, while silence could signal disinterest or poor intelligence. The mastery of conversation was a performance of both intellect and morality, one that demanded attention to nuance and social context. Religious observance intersected with everyday life in similarly peculiar ways. Church attendance, prayer timing, and public expressions of faith were expected to reflect piety without ostentation. Even minor infractions, arriving late, singing off key, or improper gestures could carry social judgment. Moral and religious codes were so intertwined with social conduct that one could rarely separate faith from performance. Attendance at church was as much a civic duty and public display as it was a spiritual practice. Taboos extended to emotional expression. Excessive laughter, visible irritation, or prolonged sadness could suggest weakness or moral failure. Even joy was measured. Modest smiles were encouraged. Uncontrolled exuberance was dangerous. Emotional life was monitored, judged, and constrained. The Victorian ideal demanded that one appear disciplined, composed, and morally upright, even while privately navigating desires, humor, or rebellion. Child rearing followed similarly strict rules. Children were trained to obey, observe, and perform from an early age. Games, meals, and leisure activities were structured to instill discipline, moral awareness, and social intelligence. Disobedience was corrected immediately, often through subtle social cues rather than explicit punishment. Education, manners, and morality were inseparable, teaching the young that survival and success required constant attention to rules, observation of social hierarchies, and performance of propriety. Finally, the strangest rule of all may have been the expectation of constant surveillance of self and others. Victorians internalized the gaze of society. Whether in private chambers, public streets, leisure spaces, or social gatherings, individuals were aware that their conduct, appearance, and even thoughts could be interpreted and judged. This internalization created a world where discipline became habitual, performance constant, and humor subtle. Subversion, when it occurred, was clever, hidden, and carefully calibrated. And yet, despite, or perhaps because of, these overwhelming rules, Victorians found ways to live fully, think creatively, and occasionally rebel. Hidden notes, whispered jokes, clandestine reading, small acts of indulgence, and private laughter allowed humanity to persist under the weight of absurd expectation. Humor, subtle defiance, and clever maneuvering became vital tools for navigating a world where every gesture, glance, and word was laden with significance. In the end, the strangest rules of Victorian times were not merely arbitrary. They were a complete moral and social framework, a lattice through which every aspect of life passed. From greetings to gestures, from dining to dress, from privacy to courtship, the Victorians operated in a universe of performance and expectation. The absurdity, the rigor, the humor, and the fear created a world that was at once confining and oddly creative. Life was a stage, and every individual a performer, navigating a complex web of propriety, morality, and subtle rebellion. It was a world in which absurdity became elegance, fear became discipline, and humor became a secret refuge. And while the rules may seem bizarre, controlling, or downright ridiculous to modern eyes, they defined an era that continues to fascinate, amuse, and bewilder. The strange, dark, and whimsical laws of Victorian life left an indelible mark, a society where humanity was disciplined, morality was performative, and survival meant mastering the delicate, peculiar dance of daily existence.